every enterprise seem to have AI models now, and there are a lot of those. What they don't seem to have is trusted access to their own data. That gap is where most agentic AI projects stall. They look great on paper, but when you actually try to deploy it, that's where things start to fail and fall. Airbyte is now tackling this by giving AI agents the ability to not just read enterprise data, but also write back into systems like Salesforce. And to unpack what this shift means for the future of enterprise AI, we have with us Mario Moscatiello, VP of Growth at Airbyte. Mario, it's great to have you on the show.
Great to be here. Thank you.
AI or Gen AI or Agentic AI, it has kind of become the only topic that we talk here at TFiR. No matter who I talk to, AI is the only topic. And what we have realized so far is that almost every enterprise, they have no shortage of AI models. Where they struggle is to actually their own enterprise data, enterprise context. If I ask you, based on your interaction, do you also feel that data connectivity is becoming a real bottleneck for agentic models as compared to the model themselves? What are you seeing when it comes to model versus data?
I think every week and every month we have new models that are coming out, and they're better and better. And you go from, general models to very specialized models, whether they're closed source or open source. So I would say the model problem has been largely solved. I think what you're seeing is that if you look at companies, whether they're small companies or large companies and enterprise and organizations, they sort of have, two things that you look at data maturity and you look at AI readiness. And yes, in a lot of the cases, companies that are highly data mature are usually the first to want to be embracing AI because they can trust their data. But in a lot of companies, and at Airbyte, we work from startups to Fortune 500. We see that even in the case of very large enterprises, like a lot of the data that these agents would need to work on is actually not available in the data integrations or in their warehouses or in their systems. And so I think data connectivity is what's causing a lot of agents also to hallucinate, because they think that they're giving the right answers to a problem, but there is no notion of semantic layer. If 10 people in the business were to ask an agent the same question, they would probably get 5 or 6 different answers. And so we're really seeing that becoming a huge bottleneck for companies. And that's definitely something that we're here, to help with. So
excellent. And what is Airbyte doing to address this problem?
So in a way, what we're seeing is that because organizations have, different levels of data maturity, what we're building is really a system that can take a lot of data from different sources for companies and sort of like organize it in a way that makes sense. And then helping those companies put that data like into action, and put that data where it needs to work. So like back into the systems that they use every day. So we're building a fully agentic platform in that sense, where we're building on top of 6 years of data movement and data integration to say, hey, like how do we help companies assemble context so that their agents can work in a smart way?
Can you talk about how it just kind of pushes Airbyte beyond just retrieving data into actually, now you're not just looking at it as not just one-way traffic, you're actually also taking actions like writing back to very sophisticated system like Salesforce. How does that bidirectional access change the way enterprise AI agents are architected, and what new governance challenges come with it? Because if you do allow your agents to start taking actions, to start writing to your sophisticated system, you need to have right governance as well. So it is not as that simple. So can you talk about the working of the CLI?
I think the CLI is one component, but where we allow developers to just interact with our platform directly from the terminal. But I think what we're talking about here is more like us enabling agent to write back to systems. If we look back at the last 5 years, this has already happened, like when it comes to, just pure data. So I'll back up a bit, but essentially we also have this feature, but there are a lot of companies a bunch of companies that have developed this feature before, which is called what we call reverse ETL or data activation. And what that means is that, before AI, you could have a DBT model that runs every day and says like, hey, who were my top spenders yesterday. And of course, what you want to do is have a system that every morning writes that back into Salesforce so that the sales team can look at, who were the biggest spenders and try to upsell them or trying to lock them into a contract as an example. And so this reverse ETL actually transforming data and writing it back to systems is not something that is just out today. It's something that companies have been doing for a while. I think the issue is that when you go from a data team writing very deterministic code that is going to run every day and just update, stuff in a CRM or in whatever system, when you go from that to an agent writing back to a system, first of all, you need to make sure that the agent is not hallucinating and that the agent is writing the right data to the right system. And second, you go from a few people within an organization, even if it's a large organization, you can team of, even a company of 10,000 people is going to have maybe 50 people, 100 people in the data team if it's already very data mature. When you go to from like 50 people to suddenly everybody's agent having access to writing back to systems, how do you know that a specific person is even allowed to write back to that record? Or how do you know that a specific person has access to the information he needs for the agent to take action? And so from a governance endpoint, like it requires way more robust, governance and so on and so forth. But you also need way better data lineage because you need to be able to understand, like, why did an agent take an action? You need traceability. You need to understand, yes, this is a non-deterministic, flow where an agent is reasoning and taking action, but you always need to be able to trace that back into, okay, but why did the agent actually make that decision? Why did the agent wrote that data? Who initiated that agent? Was it on a schedule? Was it automatic? And so on and so forth. So I think you're going from a few people in an organization owning and governing access to data to suddenly everybody being able to work on data. And so the scale at which that happens is just massive, and so it introduces a lot of challenges. So
it's available on OpenAI marketplace. What about other like cloud, Anthropic Cloud? Is there?
Yeah, we're working with
What is your long-term
plan?
Yeah,
we're working with them. It's a process. Like every company, OpenAI was quicker in this case, but it's a process, and we're working with all of the frontier labs, to have these resources officially on their marketplaces. You can still go ahead and install like an MCP into Claude. It's just pasting a link. Of course, it's nice to be in the marketplace so that people can find it quicker, and their team is also doing some work on it. But we do work with all the model providers.
Of course, if you look at Airbyte, and I have been covering Airbyte from the very early on, so I have seen your journey. Now you folks are giving agents multiple ways to interact with enterprise systems, NCP, SDK, now CLI, and of course availability in OpenAI app marketplace, and it will be available in other places as well. How do you see these interfaces evolving up? The AI market is changing very fast, so it's hard to say that. But just based on your interaction, based on your own usage, because today everybody is using AI either way, do you see one will win out as the standard, or there will be a fragmentation, there will be a mess where enterprises will have to deal with all of them depending on the kind of agents they need? Also, a lot of players, even Anthropic, they have launched managed agents because they all understand that agents are becoming another big part of the problem for enterprises to manage.
I think you hit the nail in the head, right? Like, I think it's different people within an organization will interface, will use different interfaces for different types of work. I think if you're in a marketing team and you're using Claude or OpenAI and you want to use an MCP because that's the interface, that's your interface for work, that's great. If you're a developer and you're building an agent and you need the data SDK and you're using the SDK, that's great. You're building a custom agents for a specific thing, or you're building an application that has agents in the back, that's great. And if you're again an engineer working out of your terminal and you want to have access to a command line interface to manage everything you do in this agentic application, that's okay too. And I think that what's the interesting thing is that something like we do with Airbyte agents is we can say, look, we know that enterprises need access to different interfaces for different classes of agents. But what shouldn't change is the data infrastructure behind them. So that if your marketing team is using the MCP and they're querying data, or your developers are using the SDK and the CLI, they should read from the same data. Like if at the end of the day, if the marketing person is building an agent that should answer how much revenue did we do yesterday, and an engineer doing it with the MCP, and an engineer is trying to do the same with the SDK because they're building a revenue agent. To that question, like the agent, whether it's, a question is asked from an MCP or from an SDK, like the answer should be the same. And so like what we can say is like, look, it doesn't matter whether your teams are querying from our MCP or building something custom with the SDK or the CLI. We want to make sure that they're reading and writing from the same data, so that everybody in the business speaks the same language. So.
How much say developers have when it comes to AI versus how much is the top down? Because that also dictates the kind of framework you are building, the kind of tools you're using, the kind of AI you're allowed to use or not use.
I think in smaller companies, developers have the freedom to experiment. Usually, smaller companies are more flexible and they tend to have, more usage-based pricing when it comes to like, you can experiment with a bunch of different providers and so on and so forth. I think when the companies like start scaling, you have, companies like Uber saying, wait on a second, like I don't remember the exact month, but they were saying, hey, it's March or April, and we've already used all of our token budget for a year. We need to put some governance in. And so in that sense, if you have, the board and the executives, they probably go and negotiate with one of the providers and say, hey, like if we were to deploy your models across the entire companies, what is the pricing? And so I think from a cost perspective, larger companies will tend to have more top-down, in that sense, because these models are expensive and these providers like are expensive. And so they need to put in place, again, we go back to governance. Like it's not only governance for the data side, but it's also governance for how much you're spending and many tokens they're using and are they getting ROI. But I think what's happening right now is that a lot of these companies are realizing that they also need to stay open to be working with different providers and building all of their stack in what we call like a model agnostic way. Because, for a company, if in 3 months, if you're working with one provider and another provider comes up with a better model in 3 months that is way better for you, you should be able to, in theory, swap everything you're doing and just use that model because it's going to give you a competitive advantage. And so like, I think it's kind of like a fine balance in between cost and sort of like flexibility. And that's what we're also seeing a lot of the open source models really, really taking shape. And you have some great open source models that are being developed. I certainly hope that the US will start leading the charge with open source models because I think that we're lagging behind. Especially compared to China, they have some amazing labs. They're coming up with amazing models. And I think that companies are going to look at, more and more are going to look at sovereignty, even with models. So it's going to be an interesting like 5-10 years ahead.
As we all know that a lot of companies are experimenting with AI agents, but going from a slick demo that they saw in the boardroom or with developers to production system is still hard. Can you talk about what are some of the biggest technical hurdles that keep enterprises from running thousands of autonomous agents at a scale?
Yeah, I would say like, of course, in the case of, I would say like Airbyte, in the case of Airbyte, what we see is that the integration plumbing tax is real. Every data source that you're trying to get into the model means that you have to solve for OAuth, pagination, rate limits, error handling, and all of that stuff. And so, it's stuff like the more agents you have running, the more systems they're reading and writing to. So if you now have agents writing back into Salesforce, the moment Salesforce updates their API, like it might break something. And so like integrations are still, like the number one issue in that sense, based on what we see. Because it's very hard. And then if you have 1,000 agents that are reading from hundreds of systems, it's a multiplier effect. And so like that's the number one cause that we see today. I would say the second thing is that at most companies are able to have agents work 70-80% of the time, which is kind of like a bad ceiling because when you're running, if your company has been like running autonomously, or if you want your company to run autonomously, working 80% of the time doesn't really work at scale. Especially because I think that agents sometimes make errors that are so small that are not even detected. And so, engineering has built a lot of guardrails when it comes to errors and when it comes to responses that are not what they expected, especially with deterministic code, right? Like you run code and you expect a response. If there is a drift, like there is systems that are put in place to detect like even the smaller errors. When it comes to agents, it's a completely different pair of hands. And so like I think that like that 20-30% of like, hey, can we get the agent to work 80% of the time to working, or 90% of the time to working like 99% of the time, I think that's going to be a hard problem to solve. And that's kind of like why a lot of you hear a lot about evals, making sure that we can look at regression and the performance and so on and so forth. So I think that's the second big problem. I think the third one is context degradation, which is when you just flood the agents with a lot of context and you think like, oh, the agents should be able to see all of our data and so on and so forth. The agents can produce like wrong responses because they have too much context and they don't know what's important and what's not important. And so like I think like to sum it up, like those are the three main causes. But the fourth one, to your point earlier, is governance. And we go back to security access has been built for deterministic code and for a few people within an organization managing highly secure information. But, security, guardrails, governance is not built for thousands of agents running. And so like, I think the security stack is immature. And so like, that's going to be also like a big, in my view, a big point to solve.
Now, there's a lot of geopolitical crisis going on, and decisions are being made which may or may not be good for AI. A lot of anti-AI FUD is also going on. So we are living in an era where there are a lot of advantages, and then also there is a lot of skepticism is also going on there. Regardless, what we are seeing is that more and more organizations, more and more companies, more and more countries, they do want AI sovereignty. How does Airbyte facilitate that? Because we are also, you folks also work in regulated industries, compliance-centric industries, and also when you throw the whole, of course, in EU, a lot of AI-related laws are coming into force as well. So talk about how is Airbyte helping organizations, countries to take control of their AI inside out?
Yeah, I think something we've been saying a lot for the past 2 years at Airbyte especially is that when you're working in these sensitive applications, but also when you're not, like now it's like anybody, it's you should, your first party data, it's your gold essentially as a company. And as much as you can, you should always strive for data not to leave your environment, essentially. And now this has been true for regulated industries simply because they didn't have a choice. If you're a finance organization or insurance or healthcare, well, you have no choice. Like your data by law cannot leave your environment. But when you're a software company like cloud native, maybe that matters a bit less until now, because what we're seeing is that a lot of companies are saying, yes, we're giving, Frontier Labs and all of these providers all of our context, and then we're kind of like renting back our intelligence in that sense. And so like we have hybrid deployments. We've been deploying on-prem for years because we are open source. And so what we're seeing is a lot of companies, even that are from not regulated industries, are coming to us and saying, hey, like, do you have a system for which I can give data to my agents without that data leaving my environment? And that's sort of what we're seeing today. And that's what we want to help with. And that's what we want to focus on, is how do we provide governed data access that is fully within an organization control, so that, companies are not really selling their secret sauce.
I would not ask you how would Airbyte look like 5 to 6 years from now, because we don't know what kind of technology will come in.
We don't know in 6 months.
Yeah, exactly. But if I ask you that since the whole inception and arrival of Airbyte, and if you look at today, how would you explain what is Airbyte today to organizations? What kind of company are we looking at?
Yeah, I think we're increasingly working towards becoming the context layer, for enterprise. And I think that's definitely like one aspiration that we have. And I would say, like, based on, the last point that we were discussing right now, is can we become the sovereign context layer for enterprise, where data integration is part of it, but there is a lot of work that we are doing or that we can do to help companies make sense of their data, classify their data, organize their data, and again, like making sure that everybody in the business is talking the same language, and that these agents can extract very useful information from the data. So
now, with Riot Access now live for Salesforce, what other systems are next on the roadmap for agents to take action on, not just to read from? Just tease us. Don't share too much. We can talk about it when it's ready, but just tell us, what next.
HubSpot is definitely like, we already have it working. It's kind of like next on the list. I think CRM is the biggest place where a lot of business users write their data. And so I think that's a very interesting one. And I think, next you can think of, product type systems or ticketing system, whether it is that is Zendesk or Linear or Asana and those type of tools where there's a lot of project management happening and you want, an agent to write a ticket or an agent to help you solve a ticket. And so if you're building a support system, for instance, like you want an agent to be able to write back or respond to Zendesk to a customer or something. And so those are a few of the systems that we're looking at. But, Airbyte, we have over 600 integrations on the data replication side. And we hope that one day we'll have all of those available for our agentic products. So
Mario, thank you so much for joining me and walking us through where Airbyte is headed with agents that don't just read data but actually act on it. And those who are watching, please head over to airbyte.com to check more about what they are doing in the space. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next one. Thank you.
Thank you.